Fuzzy Mud by Louis Sachar, Chapter 3, Tuesday, November 2nd, 2:55 p.m. After school, Tamaya waited by the bike racks for Marshall. The racks were empty. Most of the students at Woodridge Academy lived too far away to ride their bikes, and there were no school buses for the private school. A line of cars extended from the circular driveway up Woodridge Lane toward Richmond Road. As Tamaya watched the other kids climb into cars and drive off, she wished she had a ride too. She was already dreading the long walk home. It would feel even longer with a backpack full of books. Her face still burned with shame every time she thought about what had happened in the lunchroom. She was mad at Hope for saying what she'd said, and even madder at Monica, who was supposed to be her best friend and who should have stuck up for her. So she was a good girl. So what? What was wrong with that? Being good was partly what Woodridge Academy was all about. The students all wore school uniforms, khaki pants and blue sweaters for boys, plaid skirts, and maroon sweaters for girls. Embroidered on each sweater right under the name of the school were the words virtue and valor. Besides learning about history and math and all that, the students at Woodridge Academy were also learning to be virtuous. The school was supposed to teach them how to be good people. When Tamaya was in the second grade, she had to memorize the list of 10 virtues. Charity, cleanliness, courage, empathy, grace, humility, integrity, patience, prudence, and temperance. This year, she was learning their synonyms and antonyms. But if you actually tried to be good, Tamaya thought bitterly, everyone acted like you were some kind of freak. Marshall came out of the building. His hair was a mess, and his sweater, stretched out of shape, seemed to hang crookedly. She didn't wave. He came toward her, then trudged on past with hardly a glance. Marshall had a rule. They weren't supposed to act like friends around school. They were just two kids who walked to school together because they had to. They definitely were not boyfriend and girlfriend, and Marshall didn't want anyone thinking they were. Tamaya was surprised, however, because he wasn't going the usual way. Normally they headed up Woodridge Lane and then turned right on Richmond Road. Instead, Marshall was heading toward the side of the school. She adjusted her backpack, then caught up to him. "Where are you going?" "Home," he said, as if she just asked a really stupid question. "But I'm taking a shortcut," he snapped. That didn't make any sense. They'd walked the same way every single day for the last 3 years. How could he suddenly know a shortcut? He continued around the side of the school toward the back. He was taller than she was and was walking quickly. Tamaya struggled to keep up. "How do you suddenly know a shortcut?" she asked. He stopped and turned on her. "I don't suddenly know about it," he told her. "I've known about it my whole life." Well, that didn't make any sense either. "If you want to take the slow way home, that's up to you," Marshall said. "No one's making you come with me." That wasn't really true, and he knew it. Her mother didn't allow her to walk home alone. "I'm going with you, aren't I?" Tamaya said. "Well, then quit being a baby about it," said Marshall. She stayed with him as he crossed the blacktop, then went out into the soccer field. All she'd done was ask how he knew a shortcut, she thought. How was that being a baby? Marshall kept glancing behind him. Every time he looked back, Tamaya instinctively did too. But she didn't see anything or anybody. Tamaya still remembered her first day at Woodridge. She'd been in the second grade, and Marshall had been in the fourth. He had helped her find her classroom, pointed out where the girls' bathroom was, and personally introduced her to Mrs. Thaxton, the headmistress. The new school had seemed like a big, scary place to her, and Marshall had been her guide and protector. She'd had a secret crush on him all through second, third, and fourth grades. Maybe it still lingered a little bit inside her, but lately he'd been acting like such a jerk, she wasn't sure she even liked him anymore. Beyond the soccer field, the ground sloped down unevenly toward the chain-link fence that separated the schoolyard from the woods. As they moved closer to the fence, Tamaya could feel her heart feel her heartbeat quicken. The air was cool and damp, but her throat felt dry and tight. Just a few weeks before, the woods had sparkled with bright fall colors. Looking out the window from her classroom on the 4th floor, she'd been able to see every shade of red, orange, and yellow, so bright some days that it looked as though the hillside were on fire. But now the colors had faded and the trees looked dark and gloomy. She wished she could be as brave as Marshall. It wasn't just the woods that scared her, and what might or might not have been lurking within. Even more than that, Tamea was scared to death of getting in trouble. Just the thought of a teacher yelling at her filled her heart with fear. She knew that the other kids broke the rules all the time and nothing bad ever happened to them. Kids in her class would do something wrong, and then her teacher, Miss Filbert, would tell them not to do it, and then they'd do it again the very next day and still not get in trouble. Still, she was sure that if she went into the woods, something horrible would happen to her. Mrs. Thaxton might find out. She could get expelled. A dip in the rocky ground created a gap big enough to crawl through under a section of the fence. Tamea watched Marshall take off his backpack, then push it through the gap. She took off her backpack, too. Miss Filbert had once said that courage just meant pretending to be brave. After all, if you're not scared, then there's nothing to be brave about, is there? Pretending to be brave, Tamea shoved her backpack through the gap. There was no turning back. Now who's the goody-goody, she thought. She wiggled under the fence carefully, careful not to snag her sweater. Chapter 4. Marshall Walsh. Marshall Walsh wasn't as brave as Tamea thought. He used to have lots of friends. He used to like school. He had taken band in the 6th grade, and his music teacher, Mr. Rowan, had written on his report card that what he lacked in talent he made up for with enthusiasm. Marshall plays the tuba with gusto. He wasn't enthusiastic about anything anymore. Each day brought him nothing but more misery and humiliation, and it had all started with a new kid in his class, Chad Hillegas. Students attended Woodridge Academy for one of two reasons. Either they were really smart, or else their parents were really rich. Tamea was one of the smart ones. Marshall was an in-betweener. His parents weren't rich, but they both had good jobs, and they considered education to be extremely important. They cut back on other areas like family vacations and going out to restaurants. The reason Chad Hillegas came to Woodridge was entirely different. He'd been kicked out of 3 schools in the last 2 years. The social worker assigned to his case believed that if he was placed in a more positive environment and made to wear a school uniform, he would stop fighting and become a more conscientious and motivated student. If his parents hadn't agreed to pay for him to go to Woodridge Academy, he would have been put in a school at a juvenile detention center. So Chad had started with everyone else in September. The boys in Marshall's class were in awe of Chad. The girls seemed drawn to him too, even if he also scared them a little bit. And for the first few weeks of this year, Marshall had been right there with everyone else, hanging on to every word Chad said, nodding along in agreement, laughing at his jokes. Some people were terrified of being expelled from school. Chad bragged about it. My 4th grade teacher kept giving me a hard time, so I locked her in the closet. What did she do to you when she got out? Nothing. She's still in there. And Marshall had laughed right along with everyone else. Chad claimed he'd been kicked out of 5 schools, not just 3. He was always coming up with new stories about things he had supposedly done. The more he got in trouble, the more everyone seemed to admire him. Marshall remembered the moment Chad had turned against him. Chad had been telling about the time he had ridden his motorcycle to school. Did anyone see you? Gavin asked. Yeah, they saw me, Chad replied. I rode it right up to the steps of the school and into the principal's office. No way, Marshall exclaimed. Chad stopped talking and slowly turned to Marshall. You calling me a liar? Everyone became very quiet. Marshall hadn't meant it that way at all. He just as easily could have exclaimed, "Awesome!" "No!" "You all heard him," Chad said. "He called me a liar. Anybody else think I'm lying?" Marshall tried to explain, but Chad shredded his feeble words with a cold, hard stare. For the rest of the day, that stare seemed to follow Marshall wherever he went, and for what seemed like no logical reason to Marshall, slowly but surely, everyone else seemed to turn against him, too. "Whose side are you on?" Chad would ask. "You're either with me or you're with Buttface." At first, Marshall tried to pretend that nothing was wrong. He'd walk right up to a group of his friends and try to join in whatever they were doing, but one glance from Chad would send him away, his eyes cast down in shame. Snide whispers followed him wherever he went, along with not-so-accidental bumps in the hallways. He became afraid to speak up in class. His grades got worse. Often, when taking tests, he could feel Chad's stare burning through the back of his neck, and his mind would go blank. In other schools, where 7th grade students changed classrooms every period, Marshall and Chad might have had only 1 or 2 classes together. There were only 41 7th graders at Woodridge, however, and it was Marshall's bad luck that Chad was in every one of his classes except his last period, Latin. Marshall had a brother and a sister, twins, who were 4 years old. Even when he'd had friends and lots to do, he'd always been happy to look after them when necessary, or even when it wasn't necessary. Daniela and Eric liked to pretend they were lions in the circus. They'd crouch on top of the kitchen bar stools and growl, and Marshall would be the lion tamer. Since losing his other friends, Marshall no longer liked playing with the twins either. It made him feel like a loser. When his parents questioned him about his bad grades, he blamed it on them. "How am I supposed to study when they're roaring at me all the time?" It was the same with Timea. Everyone picked on him all day at school, and now he took it out on the only person who was nice to him. He'd hear himself say mean things to her and hate himself for it, but he couldn't seem to stop. As bad as it had been for Marshall lately, today it had gotten even worse. He'd answered a question in class right after Chad had given the wrong answer. Afterwards, as he was heading up the stairs on his way to Latin, Chad grabbed him from behind, pulled him down 3 steps, and shoved him against the railing. "Listen, Buttface, we need to settle this once and for all." "Settle what?" Marshall tried. "After school, on the corner of Woodridge and Richmond Road," Chad told him. "And you better be there, you thumb-sucking coward." Marshall and Timea always walked right past that corner on their way home. They'd been going the same way every day for 3 years. But today, he suddenly knew a shortcut.